Nice to have you here. First, we can introduce ourselves. We are Polish community. We are focused on interviewing like a really good project to get good knowledge about what's going on in the industry and how everything is working. So for sure, everyone knows here, and I think in crypto space, GMX project. So we won't make you talk about some basic stuff. We wanna do some deeper dive in your project and in your future. But at the beginning, please, could you introduce yourself and maybe tell us what is your role in this project?
Absolutely. Well, my name is Jonesy. I've been in crypto for, let me think, it's early 2023 now. I started in 2017, so I guess that's 5.5 years roughly now. I've been with GMX for the last year as a communications coordinator. So I help them in the background structure their business communication, set up AMAs and contacts with communities, keep all our partner projects happy, and organize all the cross promotion and publicity that comes with that. I do that for a year now with GMX, but I've had my own boutique communications company for the last 11 years, and I've only made the switch to crypto in the last year. So that's it's been quite a nice experience over the last year, and GMX has been an amazing project to do that with, and it's been remarkable to see everything that we've developed in the last year. So it's a pleasure to work with all the GMX collaborators, and it's really nice to be able to join communities like yours, which are interested in deep dives and the more technical sides of protocols. So it's great to be with you today.
Nice. So maybe let's start with a good question from the beginning. So firstly, we've got here some people that are really in your project from the beginning. They are big supporters and they believe that this is long-term play, but they have a few concerns about a few things. So at first, I want to ask you about multiplier points, because we've got the situation that when you are long-term stakers, it's good for you. You get more multiplier points, your rewards going up. But one of the users ask you some question like that. Do you see a potential problem with GMX earnings being diluted by the multiplier points? We can see that GMX APR that is shown on earn subpage is steadily declining due to more and more multiplier points creation. So do you think that this is a problem in the long run, and maybe new people that want to stake token and get a reward from the fees from this project won't be so happy to do it because of it?
It's a good question, actually, and I appreciate that question. I think it's a complicated issue. On the one hand, GMX is always focused on rewarding long-term holders, long-term stakers, because that's a really important aspect of creating our community. So I think that has helped in keeping people involved, keeping liquidity sticky, keeping a very close and tight-knit community. But there is, of course, a risk when you reward early adopters like that with a multiplier system that keeps adding up and that at the moment does not have a maximum yet. Because this has been under discussion whether there should be a maximum for multiplier points, whether it should be cut at 100% or similar solutions like that. But I think in the end, the problem seems to be bigger than it actually is. You see, if you were to buy GMX now and stake those tokens, then after a year, you would already be looking at 100% multiplier points as well. So you would also be receiving double your ETH rewards. And at the same time, we see that quite a lot of bigger holders at some point end up unstaking, end up exiting, burning a whole lot of multiplier points. So there is a reasonable balance there. long-term holders are rewarded, but people who get in now and commit for the long term are similarly rewarded. And when you look at those percentages, then in a sense they converge. If you were a very early staker and you held for you would hold for say 5 years, and if you were to only get in now and to hold for the next 4 years, those multiplier points would end up being quite similar, and the difference in terms of your ETH rewards would actually not be that significant at all. So I think I do understand that some people are worried that it may scare people off, that people may have the idea that they're late to the party and early adopters will always have this advantage over them. I think that the multiplier system was developed quite cleverly, and I think if you make the calculations, you will see that it's actually always worthwhile to stake for the longer term because of it. Also because they get burned substantially by stakers who unstake and leave the protocol. And there are still considerations among the core contributors whether we need to institute a certain limit for multiplier points. And that may at some point happen if we get the feeling that it really becomes unfair to new adopters. But at the moment, I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think the risk is that big.
All right. Thanks for this answer. So going forward, as far as we know, mostly team and all the expenses are covered from the tokens that are vested to the team, and this is a 2 years period. So what do you think project will do after these 2 years, and do you think that you will try to get revenue from the fees and then maybe create some kind of treasury from there to cover all the expenses and future of the GMX?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's indeed an important issue. I do think that at some point it makes sense to start to develop more of a treasury. Perhaps also with a percentage from the fees that the protocol generates, because I think, as most of you will have seen, the revenue that GMX generates is incredibly significant. It's just that as it stands, most of that revenue is shared with liquidity providers and stakers, and we have always emphasized the importance of that. Being a community project, you want to reward your liquidity providers generously. You want to reward them for the risks that they take, and you want to reward your long-term holders, the people who are most committed to your project, with the 30% share of protocol revenue. So I think that for the flywheel effect of a startup business that did really well in quickly generating volume and attracting liquidity, this model made a whole lot of sense. 70% of protocol fees going to liquidity providers, 30% going to stakers. But considering the revenue we generate, there is also room to at some point say we could allocate 1% of protocol revenues to further developing a treasury. Now, that said, GMX has a fairly healthy treasury. We've always been conservative with that, so most of it is in stable coins, and we've suffered the last bear market quite well. So we still have a healthy treasury. There is ample funds to pay the current contributors. And I think we have a runway of at least 1.5 to 2 years where we don't have to worry about any shortcoming in terms of funds. But if you're thinking in the very long term, then yeah, there's certainly the possibility, and I think in terms of the revenue we generate, also the space to allocate a tiny bit of that to a treasury and to rewarding all the contributors.
Yeah, we've got a few people that are more in the traditional businesses, and their concern is that you should create more like this treasury for the worst time, you know, because when you see project as a startup, and when you take all the revenue and giving it away. I know that this is good, because maybe not everything, but you need to put some incentives to people to put money in the GLP, and also for the tokenomics of GMX, which I like very much. But the thing that maybe just a little bit of fees put aside for the worst time for the team, for the protocol development, I think that could be quite a good idea.
That makes sense, and I completely understand that sentiment, especially if you come from a traditional finance background. You would be more focused on establishing a healthy treasury and thinking for the long term in that traditional business sense. I think in crypto, of course, we're used to thinking about these things slightly differently, and like I said, as a startup, I think in this last year, because GMX has only been around for a little more than a year after all, I think this decision made sense, especially because there wasn't a real need yet to build up even more of a treasury. You see, I was going to say team, but it's not really the right word to use for the GMX contributors, because it is a sort of loose connection of various contributors who take part, who do a lot of great work. But it's a small group of contributors. So expenses are relatively low. The lead devs are people who have been building for years and who are not looking to get rich from it. But there isn't a whole lot of expenses and overhead in terms of the expenses the protocol currently faces. So I think we're in quite a unique situation at the moment where we're quite lean. And that allows us also to be so generous to liquidity providers and the other stakeholders in the system. But it certainly makes sense that at some point in the future, you know, once the number of contributors grows, once expenses in other parts of the platform start increasing, that you have to build up a bit more of a long-term treasury. And I could certainly see a tiny percentage of protocol fees being directed to that as a sensible solution.
Great. So moving forward, we want to know a little bit more about future development of the project. So you know that I'm going to ask you about synthetics and how does it going. But firstly, I want to ask you about the token GD that you're supposed to release at the beginning of your plans, but then you took the other way and you've got another system to get liquidity for the synthetics. Can you describe how will it work, and what's the plan for that?
Yeah, you're right. The vision of the GD token underpinning the new trading system was, after a lot of discussion and research, abandoned for a slightly different system. Now, with what's upcoming, the synthetic markets update, it is, I would say it's a monumental update, and in a sense it can be seen as a GMX version 2. Because it means that there are a lot of fundamental aspects of the trading system that will further evolve, that will allow for further options and opportunities. So it will at first exist alongside the GLP liquidity provision system. And what our expectation is that more and more of liquidity will flow towards the synthetic system, which is quite different from GLP, because GLP, as most of you will probably be aware, is a sort of index fund. It's a bunch of group tokens in one pool. Synthetics will be set up quite differently. It will use isolated pools for each token, so for each token pair, I should say. So liquidity providers can decide for which pairs they provide liquidity. which alleviates some of the issues that GLP currently has, where people are trying to maintain delta neutral positions but have trouble hedging the various altcoins in GLP. In a sense, synthetic markets make that a bit more simple. It returns to an isolated pool system where each token has its own pool. People can provide liquidity for those set tokens they want. We have some plans on how to attract significant liquidity, and I also think that GMX is currently popular and well known enough that we will probably not have too much problem attracting sufficient liquidity to those pools. Now, while they work with isolated pools, they will still facilitate swaps and derivatives trading between all the assets in those various pools. So that aspect is similar to how GLP now works. Both swaps and leverage trading of all those assets will be available. And they will be tied to Chainlink Oracles for the pricing data. And that's especially where we have tried to further the system and further what was currently possible, because we've been working with Chainlink on special oracles for perpetual dexes. And that is something that we'll be announcing a bit more about in the coming month or two. And I think everybody will be surprised when they hear the results of that collaboration.
All right. So you said you will do isolated pools. So how it will work for the synthetics asset? Like, for example, you will have commodities, and then you wanna trade, for example, gold, and from which pool will take those funds to generate those synthetics? It's gonna be from stable coins, and for example,
I believe in those cases.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to confirm that in those cases, when it comes to those assets, the liquidity provision will indeed be in stable coins. Yeah.
All right. So for those assets, stable coins, and for example, if there's going to be like someone want to put leverage on Ether, there's going to be from Ether pool, Ether USD, and for Link, it's going to be Link USD, something like that. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's a general position. Yeah.
All right. So then about the fees that on the synthetics assets, fees generated from that are gonna be split the same way, like 70% for liquidity providers and 30% for GMX. Yeah.
I have to admit that that exact fee split is not yet definitively decided, so I cannot really say conclusively how that will look. It will be a similar share.
Okay. Can you maybe tell us when this development will end, when you will release this GMX 2.0?
I think we're all extremely eager to see that happen, and the devs have been working incredibly hard over the last months to get everything finished up. We've had multiple audits from multiple well-known, renowned partners. So security has been a prime concern, and that's we're now in the last phase of that. The final audit is currently being undertaken. I expect that will take another 2-3 weeks, and that within a month we'll have some very beautiful news to announce.
All right, that's awesome. That's really awesome. And going forward, we all know that traders need to have really comfortable place to use, and UX need to be really smooth. And do you think that you will do some changes there and maybe implement something like trading view for the for the charts, because we've got some TA specialists here and they were trying to use it on your site, and there was like opinion that I have not enough interval, I cannot do my drawings on this chart. So do you think that you will change the UI and maybe try to compete with your with something like GNS on this site?
Yeah, it's a good point. Multiple people have, of course, remarked over the last year that TradingView integration would make sense, and we have looked into that. But I think that with the upcoming Oracle updates that will be part of the synthetics GMX v2 update, we are looking into smaller tick sizes, and we'll be able to offer quite a bit better trade experience for traders. It will be a bit smoother. We'll have guaranteed order execution on all possible conditional orders in a way that we currently, with the GLP system and the current Chainlink Oracles, aren't yet able to offer. Because, well, as you know, GMX, because we aggregate price feeds from a number of leading centralized exchanges and Chainlink, it sort of flattens out the price. So you will see that if the price makes a wick on a centralized exchange, that it doesn't show the same wick on GMX. The fluctuations are smaller, but it also means that with the current Oracle system, with keepers, sometimes your price level will hit, but your limit order will not be filled because the keepers didn't have time to pick up the transaction on chain. That was a slight downside of the current system. That is something that's going to be improved significantly. So we'll have guaranteed order execution. There will be other additions to the trading interface that will make it even more suitable to professionals, while retaining the comfortable UX that I think we've currently managed to develop and that people have become comfortable with.
All right. Yesterday I was listening AMA, maybe more like a talk between GMX, Blueberry Club, and Starkware. There was really interesting conversation between those guys, and there was question from the audience about synthetics. And one of your guys said that the pool are gonna be constructed very much similar to the Uniswap pools, and the thing that you will do with them will be really easy to implement on other EVM chains. So does it mean that you have in plans to expand to other chains and maybe more EVM or something like ZK rollups? ZK rollups?
We certainly do, absolutely. It's been under discussion for a long time, and a lot of people in the community are eager to see expansion to different blockchains, which of course makes sense. And it has definitely been in the back of our minds. And for now, we've decided that the synthetics upgrade has to take priority. So that's what's been the singular focus over the last half year. Excuse me. And with that being finished soon, I think that chain expansion is going to be one of the main things at the top of the priority list. The new pool system fits into that quite well. And as you may have seen if you follow our governance forum, a lot of blockchains have reached out to us, both publicly in the form of proposals. We've seen the Binance chain officially post a proposal on our governance forum to request GMX to expand to Binance chain. We've seen Phantom reach out to us in a similar way. We've seen official proposal from Polygon, who would love to see GMX also expand to Polygon and develop on there. And Polygon is an interesting example then, because you mentioned the ZK rollups, and Polygon is of course working on its ZK EVM, which is a little while away, undoubtedly, because it's very complex. But nonetheless, it seems to be something they've hinted they'll be able to deliver in the coming year. So for us, it's also been a critical debate. You know, dev time is limited, and you can't expand to every chain you want to be on, let alone people in the community would love to be on. So you have to make a difficult decision. You know, where do you see a new audience that you can really reach? What blockchain has an interesting ecosystem of partners that we could collab with, projects that could build on GMX, because of course composability has been a priority for us from the beginning. So chain expansion is absolutely coming, and I'm quite sure we'll see a third chain be integrated this year, if not sooner. But I can't yet say which one that'll be. There's a lot of debate there that goes into that. But as I said, some really good contenders have reached out to us. At the same time, we're looking into the various ZK rollups, because that's, if that takes off, it's something we want to be early on, similar to how GMX adopted Arbitrum, when Arbitrum was really only something on paper. We launched the exact same day as Arbitrum did, had early contact with the Arbitrum team, off-chain labs. And it was a gamble in a way. It was a bet on the future. And if you look back now at the last year and the immense growth that Arbitrum has realized and the role that GMX has played in that as a flywheel, I think it was a brilliant decision. So I trust that with all our core contributors, we'll be able to have a very interesting debate about that, and in the end, make a good decision as to what chain to prioritize when it comes to new deployments.
All right. I heard some rumors that there's gonna be one of two chains, so maybe Zcash or Starknet, but that's just the rumor. I don't know if you wanna confirm or deny, but that's what I heard.
Indeed, cannot yet confirm or deny, but the ZK rollups are certainly on our mind. Mm-hmm. I just personally, I'm not totally sure that they will be ready yet in time. And I think Polygon ZK EVM will in that case also be an interesting competitor. But I have the feeling that there's still a fair bit of work to be done there before a functioning mainnet can be delivered and before there's an ecosystem that GMX could build on. So that may be something for a little bit further down the road. And then if that's the way we end up going, then I would expect that one of the other EVM chains would be adopted first as our third deployment.
Gotcha. That's fine. That's awesome. Do you think that you will continue floor price fund? Because I know that there was earlier some government voting and you stopped it. You use it for some development. So do you plan to come back to this?
To be honest, I think the concept of the floor price fund made a lot of sense in the first few months after GMX's launch, when it was sort of a theoretical backstop in case the market truly crashed and GMX saw no traction adoption, that we would have this very base level of, say, $1 to defend as a token price. But from the first few weeks after launch, GMX's price had already increased to $468, and the token had basically surpassed the need for this floor price fund already. It seemed at that point very unlikely that price would drop back to a level where the floor price fund would come into play. So in a sense, the floor price fund is sort of a treasury and part of that as it currently stands, because it won't, we expect, ever have to be used to backstop the price at such a low level. So those funds are now part of the treasury and for the DAO to allocate as we see necessary.
All right. So now I have to ask you about your competitors. How do you see rising competitors in your niche? Do you see GNS, Vela Exchange as a potential threat? that they will play a main role in the future development of the decentralized exchanges. So how you differ from this project and why you are better?
It's a good question. We've we've seen a lot of projects fork GMX. I don't think I mean, there must be at least 15 or something on any chain you can imagine by now. I don't think any of them gain significant traction, and that's not something that we really fear. We do really fundamentally believe in the DeFi ethos of, you know, feel free to fork us, improve upon it, and if you do it in a positive way where you reach out to the core contributors first and discuss it or semi-ask for permission, then that's all the better if it's a friendly fork in that way. But none of our forks have really gained traction in a meaningful way. I think Gains is an interesting example because we know them from a long time ago already. There have been high-level contacts between the developers of Gains and GMX quite early on. And there's been a sort of friendly rivalry between the two projects, but there's also been a lot of, I would say, cross-pollination and inspiration on both sides. I think the synthetic system that Gains has developed has been quite impressive. They were able to offer a lot of different tokens early on, and that worked well and functioned quite well, aside from some minor issues related to spreads and liquidity, which is of course difficult if you have that many assets. And in a sense, GMX now is also pivoting towards that same end goal of being able to offer synthetic assets with a wide range of different varieties so that you can accommodate pretty much any DeFi trader you like. But we've gone about it in a different way. You could say that our paths toward that goal of synthetics have been very different. GMX first focused on attracting a lot of liquidity with a simple pool system, building a big ecosystem, lots of projects building on GMX, emphasizing composability, so that we have this this flourishing ecosystem that helps us and helps Arbitrum and Avalanche grow further. Gains, in a sense, offered a lot of different assets, but with limited liquidity, which had its own negative effects on the trading experience there for quite a while. I think they were very smart to pivot to Arbitrum because their Polygon deployment worked well, but didn't get as much traction. You see that as soon as they came to Arbitrum, their GDAI vault worked really well in attracting liquidity, also attracting traders. And to be honest, we congratulate them on that. There's never been jealousy or envy in that sense. There's been a sort of friendly rivalry where, you know, elements of the protocols that work well are borrowed by the others and further built out. And I think that's healthy. That's the DeFi mentality in a way. You know, you want people to be able to learn from you, further build on you, and also copy you in a sense, and then improve upon that. And that results in thought-provoking solutions, which then force you to keep iterating and keep improving. I don't think GMX would be where it is right now if it wasn't for other interesting DeFi protocols that push the limits of what's possible, that try to come up with solutions for the difficulties of organizing trading at this scale on a DEX. So I think in a sense it makes us all better off that we try to stimulate each other to ever higher heights and try to come up with ever better solutions to those DeFi problems. Is Gains a competitor? Yeah, I would say Gains is a competitor. I'm not sure if in the long run I would say they're a competitor to GMX that we are worried about. I think most of us are very confident in our ability to keep building, very confident in the GMX V2 system we've slowly developed and will be rolling out. So I mean, we look at the future as being quite bright, and I think it's also important to keep in mind that it's likely that the entire DEX space and the entire DeFi perpetual space is going to be growing at a sizable level for the foreseeable 5-10 years. It's quite likely that more and more trading comes on chain. The risks of centralized exchanges have become ever more apparent in the last year. So you see that there's this gentle change towards decentralized solutions. And I wouldn't be surprised if that segment keeps growing at such a steady pace, 10, 20, 30% a year, foreseeable perhaps for the next 10 years, that there's more than enough room in the ecosystem for various DeFi perp solutions. And I would love to see that, in fact, to be able to look back in 5 years and say, it's amazing where GMX ended up. It's incredible to see the solutions Gains came up with, and the fact that they're still thriving. And you mentioned Vela. I haven't looked into Vela solutions in technical detail. So I look forward to see what they deliver as well. As it stands, I have the feeling that they first have to show what they've built and whether it's actually as promising as their promotion makes it sound like. But we're happy to embrace all that competition, and I would love to see all those projects thrive and just the general DeFi space keep growing for the coming decade. I think that's the vision that we have ultimately.
All right. Yes, that's true. That's true. Good competition. It's really nice for us, for just users, and you will have more motivation to develop more smart and better solutions for sure.
Yes, it helps. It really does. It keeps you sharp. Absolutely.
Yeah. So going forward, we know that traders still mostly they choose CEXs over DEXs. So what do you think need to change to onboard them to the DEXs? And is this narrative after FTX good enough to just spread the words about DEXs? And do you think that this just holding your crypto and not placing it on a wallet, on exchange's wallet, good narrative to bring more people? What need to change in the DEXs to bring this all daily traders to you?
Yeah, that's a key question in a way when you're looking at this transition from the CEX to the DEX space that we've seen very slowly unfolding over the last years. But if you look at those charts, it's undeniable that there's more and more market share being claimed by DEXs. And it's undeniable that DEXs have been able to facilitate more and more proper trading, have been able to deliver better UI and UX, better liquidity. So you see that, for the first time now this year, it's possible for whales to comfortably trade 100 million positions on GMX and prefer that over their CEX alternatives. So I think we're, as a whole, the space is proving that it's possible to take over market share from the centralized exchanges. And I think we've seen plenty of illustrations in the last year of why it's important that move continues. There's a lot of positive aspects to custodial solutions as well. Centralized exchanges, of course, currently can still offer a more smooth experience and more asset variety. But those challenges for the DeFi space are actively being tackled, and I would say are actively being conquered constantly. You see that liquidity provision is becoming better and better on DEXs, and there are more and more clever solutions being devised to come up with that. You see that trade execution, blockchain speed, with blockchains like Arbitrum and Avalanche, which we're deployed on, they offer finality in such a rapid way that it almost feels like a sex experience sometimes. You're getting under a second confirmations. You're able to stream in a really smooth way execute your transactions, and that's ultimately what we've been looking for when it comes to decentralized exchanges. And I think that's only going to keep getting better. I see the interesting visions that GMX and other competitors have. I see that there are more and more possibilities to also deliver on those visions. And I think that in the end, more and more trade will move on chain, and the advantages of that will become more and more apparent as the difference between DEXs and sexes gets ever smaller.
Do you plan maybe to implement some kind of mobile app, or maybe join some other big player on the market to integrate with them, and then have opportunity to reach bigger audience, more traders?
Yeah, it's a good point. Of course, being able to offer a mobile app would be another step up. And I do think that the GMX app works quite well on various mobile browsers. The reason we haven't emphasized the development of a mobile app is mainly for security reasons, that it comes with a lot of safety issues that you have to be very careful about. And GMX has always emphasized security of all the liquidity that users have provided on the system. We take that responsibility serious because there's significant amounts of money on the line, and the last thing you want as a DEX that's building for the long term, that's trying to get the community to ever grow and get ever more trust in the decentralized space and the DEX system. It's so important to avoid those type of catastrophes where you launch a mobile app and it turns out that there's a vulnerability somewhere, and you end up exposing your users or liquidity providers to crises. So the reason we haven't yet emphasized developing a mobile app is for those reasons, that we weren't sure if it could be done completely safely. So there were other priorities that we wanted to focus on. That said, we do very much believe in integrating with more and more wallets. We have an interesting example in the form of Change wallet from Change Finance. That's Chain with CHAIN. They integrated GMX's margin trading module into their wallet, and that works quite well. So that's a good example of what's possible when DeFi projects collab in that way. I expect that we'll be reaching out to many more wallets to see what's possible in that area, to see if we can convince them to integrate GMX. And I think that's a logical step for us to take in the coming period. Whether we will develop our own mobile app at some point, I think that's a little bit further out. For now, the focus is more on ever improving the UI, UX, and technical opportunities that the protocol offers. But a mobile app would make sense at some point. I just think that the most logical route for us at the moment is by integrating with other partners rather than developing our own app. But this is something that I'm sure will be discussed in detail also among the core contributors.
How many synthetic assets you plan to release when update will come?
The potential is in a sense limitless, because any asset would be able to be listed for which Chainlink can provide one of their new price feeds. But I think that in the beginning we will focus on what you might say are the typical popular DeFi assets. So altcoins that are popular and do good volume. The typical coins that most people would think of when you're thinking of the majors and blue chips that are not currently represented in GLP. That's what we would first focus on, making possible.
All right. And what do you think are the biggest threats to GLP? Its stability and maybe there was some issue with GLP on the AVAX. Do you think that this will happen again, or maybe this is possible on the Arbitrum chain?
I think that the manipulation example from AVAX from I guess it was 4, 5, 6 months ago. That really had to do with the very, very thin books that were then present. So somebody could manipulate the books on a centralized exchange and then extract profit from the minor price difference with GMX. I think we saw that risk very clearly when that happened and addressed it very thoroughly also by implementing limits on OI and further controls and having various keepers monitor price feeds. And there's been a lot done to prevent that type of exploit to be possible later on. And I think even at that state, that would only have been possible on Avalanche, which happened to have very thin books then, and would not ever be possible on ETH or ETH or BTC or tokens that have significantly more liquidity in the market. So I'm not too worried about that type of risk to GLP. You occasionally see mentioned that people are worried that a too profitable trader will end up draining GLP. I think these risks are also generally overstated. You see that when it comes to longs, and quite a lot of the open interest on GMX is positioned long. There really isn't much risk to the GLP pool from a lot of people being long. Even if the market pumps, the only thing that really happens is that the GLP pool rents out the upside. So the price appreciation on the assets in GLP, that profit then goes to the traders who were long. But the assets in GLP themselves appreciate along with that price rise. So GLP doesn't actually lose value, it just loses out on upside when people are profitable on their longs. It's the inverse scenario that is theoretically more of a risk when, say, 80 or 90% of the open interest would be short, and you saw an incredible market dump as we have, let's say once a year when the COVID pandemic was raging. I'm sure we all remember those dark days. There are moments where the market can collapse 30% in a day, and those are the edge cases that we've looked into and tried to ensure cannot really cripple the protocol. In those cases, if everybody were to be short and if the market were to crash, then you would have to pay out a lot of profit to traders, and at the same time the assets in GLP would be losing value. Sure, then GLP holders would take a hit, but I think that is literally the only significant risk scenario. And I think if you look at the actual performance of GLP over the last year, you see that it has done incredibly well and held up better than many people dare to expect. I mean, if you bought GLP a year ago before much of the bear market, and you held it until now, you would still come out practically even in just because of the massive fees that GLP holders have gained, and because of the profits from unprofitable traders which flow to GLP holders. So there is a well-calculated balance in how GLP has been structured to make sure that fees balance out any possible losses, that risks are minimized. As a protocol, we really do take that responsibility very seriously. So able to attract such an incredible amount of assets under management. You don't get to 400 million GLP pool if people don't feel comfortable parking their funds there.
How many people is in GMX team?
Yeah, like I said, we don't really have a team, but there's a group of core contributors, which is, I would say, 6 or 7 people. And then there's another group of, say, 5 contributors around that, and a wider ecosystem of supporters and helpers and moderators and people around them. But we're looking at a group of, say, 12 contributors, not much more than that.
All right. This is not a big number. So that's good.
No, exactly.
I want to ask you, how is it possible that Blueberry Club managed to do bigger leverage on your protocol? Because they've got some on their side is trading, and they are using GMX underneath. So how is it possible that they can do bigger leverage? If you know.
I think that's a good question, actually. I haven't really looked into the technical specifications of how they have developed their trading system, but I think the underlying factor is that the GMX contracts do allow leverage to exceed 50x. It's just that the interface at the app maximizes it at 50x. And I think so. Technically, it is possible for somebody to program, a front-face app where leverage could be increased further. And you see this also, for example, from successful traders who at some point withdraw a substantial amount of their collateral and end up with leverage far above 50x. So technically, the system does make it possible to do that.
All right. I want to ask you about one other project that I think GMX is supporting. So this project is Puppet Finance, and this is something like copy trading, something like that. And the question is, don't you think that this project won't be good for the GLP vault? Because if you've got good traders and some other people can copy their trades, that means that they will drain GLP vault. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's. I do get the scenario that you paint. I think it is one of the risks that you always have when it comes to copy trading, is that it emphasizes the direction that the market already has. If most successful traders are long, and all those copy traders will follow them in those longs, and you get an even more skewed OI towards longs. That is a risk that's inherent in allowing sort of the crowd to follow the more successful traders. I think any copy trading protocol faces that. But I haven't really seen enough examples of successful copy trading protocols where this became a significant issue. So I would be surprised if the number of traders that such a copy trading protocol managed to attract becomes of such scale that it meaningfully impacts this skew in open interest. I think in general the market tends to humble traders on all sides at some point, and only actively managing your trades probably keeps you from avoiding those risks. And that's the problem with copy trading, in a sense, is that you delegate that responsibility to whatever vault or whatever trader you're following, and he's probably actively monitoring it and being able to respond very quickly. But as a sort of passive participant, I think you also expose yourself to risks in that sense. So I'm personally not too worried about Puppet Finance and other social trading protocols like STFX, which is also integrated GMX, really posing a risk to the protocol in that sense. I don't see that happening.
All right. I don't think that it's gonna be a really big threat to GLP, but yeah, it's nice to know your opinion on this topic. So maybe 1 or 2 questions and we'll be done, because it's almost 1 hour and I don't want to take much of your time. So at the end, I want to ask you about another rumor I heard, because I heard something that you are in it. You are talking with Polish project Redstone, and they are doing Oracle to implement on your project. So is that true?
I have to say that part is new to me. So either you have access to some Polish alpha that I don't know yet, but I honestly cannot confirm that rumor. I have no idea.
All right.
We're working on an elaborate new Oracle system, and it's together with Chainlink, and that announcement is definitely going to turn some heads and really innovate in the DeFi perp space. But whether that company is a part of it, I honestly can't say.
Okay. And one more question to clarify some basic stuff, because we know that the fees on your site are gonna change. Depends how many traders are on the other side of the market, so long or short. So to clarify that, you do not using funding rate, but have these bigger fees to open the positions when GLP is used a lot. So can you explain more? How does it work exactly?
Yeah, that's right. In the current GLP system, it's really about utilization. So the more a certain asset is being borrowed, the more the percentage interest rises. Conversely, if the asset you borrow is less popular, then you pay significantly less interest. That's why it's always worth taking a good look at what you want to put your collateral in. If you look at the trading interface, you see there's a small button that also allows you to select what you want your collateral to be in. And if you look at the utilization of the various stable coins, for example, in GLP, then you will often see that perhaps USDC is facing high utilization and will have you paying a high APR to borrow it. But if you were to switch to DAI or Frax as collateral, you would pay significantly less. So it's definitely worth looking into that and to look carefully at what you want your trade collateral to be in, because it can make a sizable difference, especially if you're holding your trades for a bit longer term. It makes sense to minimize those payments, and carefully looking at collateral and utilization is an important part of that.
But
because we've seen quite high utilization, of course, in recent times, with a couple of whales taking sizable positions and, in a sense, claiming a lot of the liquidity for themselves, thereby raising interest rates for everybody. So there's a little bit of alpha in carefully looking at what you actually use as collateral for your trades, because there's definitely profit to be made from picking the right collateral.
But do you know how will it work for the synthetic assets?
In the synthetic system, there will be a sort of funding fee which tries to balance the open interest skew, so that people are encouraged to take the opposite side of trades. So that will base itself on a more typical mechanism of using funding fees and incentivizing counter trades to keep the OI skew balanced.
All right. So the last question. So we know that now we've got this AI trend, and a lot of people is talking about Chat GPT and Midjourney and all that stuff, and it is really hot on the market. So the question from the community was, do you have any plan to maybe onboard AI to your project and implement some solutions?
I have to admit that honestly, it's not something we're actively looking at. I do look in amazement at those projects that you mentioned and the things that have become possible in the last months. It's certainly impressive, and there are ways in which you can imagine using those for your project, but a clear integration of AI functionality into GMX protocol, I don't really see yet. I don't think we're there yet, and I wouldn't really predict the growth of that segment to to a point where I could say this is something that would really add value to GMX. I mean, we put out a lot of content, and you can have ChatGPT help you with writing your content. But does that really make for better content, more engaging content? Probably not. It just saves you some time. You know, is that a revolutionary improvement? I don't really think so. On the visual side, you can have, you know, these things help you with creating better content and perhaps more engaging images. But those are the implementation that you currently see with what's possible now. You know, where this AI sector development goes in the next few years, and whether there are then ways in which we can effectively integrate it. It's possible. I mean, I look at the sector with significant interest, but I don't really currently see any clear use case yet.
All right. That was just this. I was curious, we were curious, so we've got an answer. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. That was really nice 1 hour of talk. Really pleasure to have you here. We wish you the best in the project. We are big supporters to your project, and we hope that everything with your update will work 100% good.
No, we're definitely doing our best to ensure that it will be very successful upon launch.
Maybe
it's been lovely to be with you guys. I really enjoyed the chat, and if anybody has a final question, feel free to throw it out there. Otherwise, let's wrap up, and I wish you all a lovely evening.
Sure. If someone want to ask some questions, so just raise their hand one last, and if not, maybe you wanna share something, maybe some alpha to our community, or something that you wanted to share with us.
Well, yeah, I can't share any direct alpha aside from the fact that I can convincingly state that I'm really looking forward to what's going to be announced and launched in the coming month and a half, and I think everybody's going to be impressed.
Okay, so we got one last question from the laugh, so go ahead, just unmute and.
Okay, hello guys. Thank you for interesting AMA.
I love
okay, my question is because during conversation you also mentioned GNS, Vela Exchange, and the other potential competitors, and you said also that you see them as not really as a rivals, but this is healthy competitors, and they stimulate GMX to further development and so on and so on. But my question is, are you not afraid that because of being new in the space, I mean, they are newer, or they are getting, I would say from my perspective, more traction than GMX right now, that are you not afraid exodus of the traders from your exchange to the potential competitors? And if you do, how do you plan to keep your community around you, and how do you plan to keep attention of the whole community, and I would say the whole space around you, in comparison to the others project? Yeah, thank you.
No, it's a fair question. I think fundamentally I have significant conviction in the GMX core contributor group of builders, and in their vision, and in what we're currently going to be delivering, that I can safely state that I'm not worried about a fundamental transformation of the space where one of our competitors completely takes us over and we end up marginalized. I don't see that happening, because I think that with the current amount of volume we do, the amount of liquidity that we have generated, and the amount of traders that have found GMX, know about GMX, and keep coming back to trade on GMX, I think we have a very healthy base created. I think we have a very healthy moat in terms of other protocols in the Avalanche and Arbitrum ecosystem building on us, further creating a certain stability and locking up tokens and improving the functionality that GMX offers. And as I hinted at earlier also, I think that the entire DEX space is going to grow at a pace where there's more than enough room for plenty of these protocols to be successful. But ultimately, I think the difficulties that GMX has faced, even though we've had an incredible year, there were a few points of struggle, and there's a few points you want to improve on. I think we're actively addressing pretty much all of those, and I think that GMX Market, the upcoming V2 of our protocol, is going to address most of those and really take another step when it comes to effective on-chain DEX trading. There are other protocols that I admire for sure in the space. I see a number of teams coming up with interesting things. I just do not see, or I don't experience that as a fear that they are going to be taking over our users, our liquidity providers. I think, for example, Gains' recent popularity makes sense because they just came to Arbitrum. They managed to develop a clever GDAI vault concept which attracted sufficient liquidity to create a flywheel for a significant amount of traders to trade on there in the last months. And with the number of assets that they can offer, more power to them. They did a good job. But I think that with GMX soon being able to offer a similar range of assets and have better liquidity show for it, and probably also better UI and UX in a certain number of important aspects. No, I think we'll happily take that competition, and we'll happily use it to push ourselves to even further and keep iterating and keep improving and keep listening to what our traders and community signal are the strongest aspects that we keep building on, and are the small obstacles that still exist, and we try to constantly alleviate those. So no, I'm not worried in that sense. I think we're going to keep doing very well, and I really look forward to everything that's going to be launched in the coming months, and I think it will be impressive, and a lot of people are in a sense perhaps underprepared for what's going to come.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for great AMA. I hope that we will repeat this in some weeks. Thank you. See you.
No, I'd love to come back at some point. Absolutely. Thanks for your question, and thanks everybody else for being present and your contributions, and of course thanks to the whole Qdo community for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. So have a great rest of the day, and see you around.
All right. See you. Ciao.